When we speak about happiness, we often imagine moments, celebrations, achievements, or personal milestones. But what is frequently overlooked is the foundation upon which those moments stand. Health is not simply one aspect of life. It is the condition that makes every other aspect possible. Without it, happiness becomes fragile, inconsistent, and often out of reach. Consider this from a psychological perspective. The human mind does not operate independently of the body. Our thoughts, emotions, and perceptions are deeply influenced by our physical state. When the body is fatigued, undernourished, or unwell, the mind follows suit. Clarity diminishes, patience shortens, and even small challenges begin to feel overwhelming. In contrast, when the body is cared for, when it is rested, nourished, and active, the mind becomes more resilient, more focused, and more capable of experiencing genuine contentment. Philosophically, this raises an important point. Happiness is not merely something we chase externally. It is something we cultivate internally. And that cultivation begins with health. It is difficult, if not impossible, to sustain a sense of fulfillment when your physical or mental well-being is compromised. You may achieve success, recognition, or material comfort, but without health, these accomplishments often feel hollow or short-lived. There is also a subtle but powerful truth here. Health shapes our experience of reality itself. Two people can live in the same environment, face the same circumstances, and yet experience life entirely differently. The difference often lies in their state of well-being. A healthy individual is more likely to perceive opportunities, to engage positively with others, and to respond constructively to adversity. An unhealthy individual, on the other hand, may feel trapped, reactive, or disconnected, not because of the world around them, but because of the condition within them. This is why health must be understood not as a luxury, but as a priority. It is not something to be attended to only when problems arise. It is the baseline that supports every ambition, every relationship, and every moment of joy. When we neglect it, we are not just risking illness, we are limiting our capacity to live fully. From a broader perspective, this idea also challenges a common misconception. Many people believe that happiness will come after they achieve certain goals, after they succeed, earn more, or reach a particular status. But if health is compromised along the way, those goals often fail to deliver the happiness they promised. The reality is much simpler, yet more demanding. Happiness is built through the choices we make daily, and health is at the center of those choices. So when we talk about choosing health, we are not just talking about avoiding disease. We are talking about enhancing the quality of our thoughts, the depth of our emotions, and the richness of our experiences. We are talking about creating the conditions in which happiness can naturally emerge and sustain itself. And perhaps the most important insight is this. Health is not something you appreciate only after it is lost. It is something you must actively protect while you still have it. Because in the end, happiness is not built on what you achieve, but on what you are able to experience. And without health, even the best of life can pass you by unnoticed. If health is the foundation of happiness, then our daily choices are the architects that shape it. What we often underestimate is not the importance of major decisions, but the quiet, repetitive actions that fill our ordinary days. These small behaviors, what we eat, how we move, how we rest, seem insignificant in isolation, yet over time, they accumulate into something far more powerful. They define the quality of our lives. From a psychological standpoint, habits are deeply embedded patterns that operate below the level of conscious thought. Once formed, they guide our behavior automatically, which means that much of our well-being is not determined by occasional effort, but by consistent routine. This is both a challenge and an opportunity. It means that neglecting small, healthy practices can gradually erode our well-being without us even noticing. But it also means that positive habits, once established, can sustain our health with surprisingly little effort. Consider the role of nutrition. The food we consume is not just fuel. It is information for the body and the brain. It influences energy levels, mood stability, and cognitive performance. Diets high in processed foods and sugar often lead to fluctuations in energy and irritability, while balanced, nutrient-rich meals support steady focus and emotional balance. Over time, these differences are not trivial. They shape how we experience each day, how we respond to stress, and how we interact with others. The same can be said for physical activity. Exercise is often framed as a tool for physical appearance, but its deeper value lies in its effect on the mind. Regular movement improves not only strength and endurance, but also mental clarity and emotional resilience. It reduces stress, enhances mood, and fosters a sense of control over one's own body. Importantly, it does not require extreme effort. Consistency matters far more than intensity. A simple daily walk, maintained over months and years, can have a profound impact. Sleep, perhaps more than anything else, illustrates the power of daily choices. It is the period in which the body repairs itself and the mind processes experience. Yet it is often sacrificed in the pursuit of productivity or entertainment. The consequence is not just fatigue, but a diminished capacity to think clearly, regulate emotions, and make sound decisions. In other words, poor sleep does not just affect how you feel, it affects who you are in your daily interactions and judgments. Philosophically, this leads to an important realization. We are not shaped by our intentions, but by our actions. Many people intend to live healthy, balanced lives, but intention alone has no power unless it is translated into consistent behavior. And consistency is built not through motivation, which fluctuates, but through discipline and structure. There is also a deeper sense of responsibility embedded in this idea. Each choice we make is, in a way, a statement about what we value. When we choose convenience over nourishment or distraction over rest, we are prioritizing short-term comfort over long-term well-being. Over time, these priorities become our reality. Conversely, when we make deliberate, health-conscious choices, even small ones, we begin to align our actions with a broader vision of a better life. What makes this perspective empowering is its simplicity. You do not need to transform your entire life overnight. You do not need extreme measures or perfect consistency. What matters is direction. Small improvements, repeated daily, create momentum. And that momentum, sustained over time, leads to meaningful change. So when we speak about choosing health, we are really speaking about choosing wisely in the moments that seem too small to matter. Because those moments, when repeated, become patterns, and those patterns become your life. And the truth is straightforward. Your future health and happiness are not determined by what you do occasionally, but by what you choose to do every single day. At this point, it becomes necessary to address something that is often acknowledged, yet still widely misunderstood: the role of mental health. For a long time, health was viewed almost exclusively through a physical lens, as though the mind and body operated on separate tracks. But modern psychology, and indeed lived experience, tells us something very different. Mental health is not secondary to physical health. It is inseparable from it. In many ways, it is the lens through which we interpret every aspect of our lives. You can be physically strong, financially stable, and externally successful, yet still feel a persistent sense of dissatisfaction, anxiety, or emptiness. This is not a contradiction. It is a reflection of imbalance. Because happiness is not simply a product of external conditions. It is deeply tied to internal stability. And that stability, depends on the state of the mind. From a psychological perspective, the mind is constantly processing information, interpreting events, assigning meaning, and generating emotional responses. When this process is healthy, we are able to navigate challenges with clarity and perspective. We can experience stress without being overwhelmed by it. We can encounter setbacks without losing our sense of direction. But when mental health is neglected, this process becomes distorted. Minor issues feel magnified, negative thoughts become persistent, and the ability to cope begins to erode. Stress is a useful place to begin this discussion because it is one of the most common experiences in modern life. In small doses, stress can be motivating. It can sharpen focus and drive action. But when it becomes chronic, when it is not managed or released, it begins to take a toll, not just on the mind, but on the body as well. Sleep is disrupted, energy declines, and even the immune system can weaken. Over time, unmanaged stress creates a state in which both health and happiness become difficult to sustain. This is why practices like mindfulness, reflection, and emotional regulation are not abstract ideas. They are practical tools. They allow us to step back from automatic reactions and engage with our thoughts more deliberately. Instead of being controlled by every passing emotion, we learn to observe, to question, and to respond with intention. This shift, subtle as it may seem, has profound implications. It creates space between stimulus and response, and in that space lies the ability to choose wisely. Relationships also play a critical role in mental health. Human beings are inherently social, and the quality of our connections often determines the quality of our emotional lives. Supportive relationships provide reassurance, perspective, and a sense of belonging. On the other hand, toxic or neglected relationships can contribute to stress, self-doubt, and isolation. Choosing to invest in meaningful connections is, therefore, not just a social decision, it is a psychological necessity. Philosophically, this brings us to an important insight. The mind is both a powerful ally and a potential obstacle. Left unattended, it can drift toward negativity, comparison, and self-criticism. But when it is trained and cared for, it becomes a source of strength, clarity, and resilience. The difference lies in awareness and intention. There is also a common misconception that mental health is only a concern when something goes wrong, when there is anxiety, depression, or emotional distress. But in reality, mental health is something that must be maintained continuously, just like physical health. It requires attention, effort, and, at times, discipline. Ignoring it does not make it stable. It simply allows problems to develop unnoticed. What makes this idea particularly important in the context of happiness is that the mind shapes our interpretation of reality. Two individuals can face the same circumstances, yet experience them in entirely different ways depending on their mental state. This means that improving mental health does not necessarily change the external world, but it transforms how we experience it. So when we speak about choosing health, we must include the mind in that choice. We must recognize that caring for our thoughts, managing our emotions, and nurturing our relationships are not optional. They are essential components of a fulfilling life. Because ultimately, happiness is not just about what happens to you, but about how you process what happens. And a healthy mind is what makes that process work in your favor. As we continue this line of thought, there is a principle so widely known that it is often dismissed as obvious, yet it remains one of the most neglected truths in how people approach their lives. Prevention is better than cure. Not simply in a medical sense, but as a way of thinking, a mindset that prioritizes foresight over reaction. Most individuals do not consciously choose to damage their health. Rather, they postpone caring for it. There is a quiet assumption that the body will continue to function regardless of neglect, that the mind will tolerate prolonged stress, and that any consequences can be addressed later. But the reality is less forgiving. By the time symptoms appear, the underlying causes have often been developing for years. From a psychological perspective, this tendency is deeply human. We are wired to prioritize immediate comfort over long-term benefit. The inconvenience of exercise today feels more real than the abstract possibility of illness years from now. The pleasure of unhealthy food outweighs the distant risk of chronic disease. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a bias in how we perceive time and consequence. But if left unexamined, it leads to patterns of behavior that gradually undermine both health and happiness. What makes prevention powerful is not that it eliminates all risk, but that it shifts control back to the individual. Instead of waiting for problems to emerge and then reacting under pressure, you begin to act with intention before those problems take root. This changes not only outcomes, but also your relationship with your own well-being. You move from a reactive position to a proactive one. Consider how this applies to physical health. Regular checkups, balanced nutrition, consistent movement. These are not dramatic interventions, yet they significantly reduce the likelihood of serious illness. More importantly, they preserve energy, mobility, and independence over time. The absence of disease is not the only goal. The presence of vitality is equally important. The same principle applies to mental health. Addressing stress early, maintaining boundaries, and allowing time for rest are forms of prevention. When ignored, stress accumulates, often leading to burnout, anxiety, or emotional exhaustion. But when managed consistently, it remains within a range that is not only tolerable, but sometimes even productive. Prevention, in this sense, is not about avoiding all difficulty. It is about preventing difficulty from becoming overwhelming. There is also a philosophical dimension to this idea that is worth considering. Prevention requires a certain respect for the future. It demands that we value the person we will become, not just the person we are today. This is an act of responsibility, but also of self-awareness. It reflects an understanding that our current actions are shaping a version of ourselves that we will eventually have to live with. Yet one of the reasons prevention is so often neglected is that its benefits are not immediately visible. When you avoid illness, there is no clear moment of reward. When you maintain balance, there is no dramatic transformation. The outcome is simply stability, and stability is easy to take for granted. But its absence is impossible to ignore. In contrast, the cost of neglect is rarely subtle. It appears as fatigue that does not go away, as stress that becomes unmanageable, as conditions that require time, money, and energy to treat. And by that point, the process is no longer about maintaining well-being. It is about recovering it. This is where the deeper insight lies. Prevention is not about living in fear of what might go wrong. It is about creating conditions in which things are less likely to go wrong in the first place. It is a quiet, consistent investment in a future that is more stable, more capable, and ultimately more fulfilling. So when we speak about choosing health, we are also speaking about choosing awareness over neglect and intention over delay. We are choosing to act before action becomes unavoidable. Because in the end, the difference is simple but profound. It is far easier to maintain your health than it is to rebuild it once it has been lost. As we bring these ideas together, another principle begins to emerge. One that is less about individual actions and more about how those actions are organized within the structure of our lives. That principle is balance. Not as a vague ideal, but as a practical necessity. Because even the right choices, when taken to extremes or neglected in certain areas, can lead to the very imbalance we are trying to avoid. Modern life, by its nature, tends to reward excess. Productivity is often prioritized over rest, ambition over well-being, and constant engagement over reflection. There is an underlying assumption that more is always better. More work, more output, more achievement. But this mindset overlooks a fundamental truth. Human capacity is not limitless. Without balance, even positive pursuits can become sources of stress and dissatisfaction. From a psychological standpoint, balance is what allows different dimensions of life to support rather than compete with one another. Work provides purpose and structure, but without rest, it leads to exhaustion. Social interaction creates connection, but without solitude, it can become overwhelming. Physical activity builds strength, but without recovery, it results in strain. Each element has value, but only when it exists in proportion to the others. This is where many people struggle, not because they lack awareness, but because they underestimate the cumulative effect of imbalance. Skipping rest for a few days may seem harmless. Prioritizing work over personal time may feel necessary. But over time, these patterns create a system that is unsustainable. Energy declines, motivation becomes inconsistent, and the sense of fulfillment begins to fade. There is also a philosophical dimension to balance that is worth considering. A well-lived life is not defined by a single achievement or a dominant focus, but by the integration of multiple aspects of experience. It is not enough to succeed professionally if personal well-being is compromised. It is not enough to maintain physical health if mental clarity and emotional stability are neglected. True fulfillment comes from alignment, a state in which different parts of life reinforce each other rather than pull in opposing directions. Balance, however, does not mean perfection. It does not require that every day be evenly distributed or that every area receive equal attention at all times. Life is dynamic, and there will be periods where certain priorities take precedence. What matters is not constant equilibrium, but the ability to return to it. The awareness that something is out of alignment and the willingness to correct it is what sustains long-term well-being. In practical terms, this often comes down to boundaries. Knowing when to stop working, when to rest, when to disconnect, and when to engage. These decisions are not always easy, particularly in environments that encourage continuous activity. But without them, the structure of life becomes reactive rather than intentional. You begin to respond to demands instead of directing your own energy. Another important aspect of balance is the role of self-care, not as indulgence, but as maintenance. Just as physical systems require upkeep to function properly, so do mental and emotional systems. Taking time to recover, to reflect, and to reset is not a luxury. It is a requirement for sustained performance and well-being. What makes balance particularly relevant in the context of happiness is that it creates stability. And stability allows for consistency, not just in health, but in how we experience life. Without it, happiness becomes unpredictable, dependent on external circumstances or temporary successes. With it, there is a steady foundation that supports both achievement and contentment. So when we speak about choosing health, we are also speaking about choosing proportion over excess, awareness over impulse, and sustainability over short-term gain. We are recognizing that a meaningful life is not built through intensity alone, but through the careful distribution of time, energy, and attention. Because ultimately, it is not how much you do in one area that defines your well-being, but how well you manage all areas together. And without balance, even the best efforts can lead you away from the life you are trying to build. As we reach the final stage of this discussion, it becomes clear that the decision to choose health is not confined to the individual. It extends outward, influencing others in ways that are often subtle but deeply significant. Health, in this sense, is not just a personal asset, it is a social force. The way we live, the habits we adopt, and the standards we set inevitably shape the environment around us. human behavior is, to a large extent, influenced by observation. We learn not only through instruction, but through example. The people around us, family, friends, colleagues, serve as constant reference points for what is normal, acceptable, and desirable. When someone consistently prioritizes their health, they are not simply improving their own life, they are redefining what others perceive as possible and worthwhile. From a psychological perspective, this is closely tied to the concept of social modeling. Individuals are more likely to adopt behaviors they see practiced and sustained by others, particularly when those behaviors are associated with positive outcomes. When health is visibly linked to energy, clarity, and emotional stability, it becomes attractive. It moves from being an abstract recommendation to a tangible reality. This influence is especially powerful within close relationships. In families, for example, habits are often shared and reinforced over time. The way meals are structured, the importance given to physical activity, the approach to stress, all of these patterns are learned through daily interaction. A single individual choosing to live differently can gradually shift these patterns, creating a ripple effect that extends across generations. The same principle applies within communities. Environments that encourage healthy behavior, whether through shared values, supportive networks, or accessible resources, tend to produce individuals who are more engaged, more resilient, and more optimistic. Conversely, environments that normalize neglect or imbalance can reinforce patterns that are difficult to break. This highlights an important point. While personal responsibility is essential, the collective context in which we live also matters. There is also a philosophical dimension to this idea that invites reflection. Choosing health is not only an act of self-care, it is, in many ways, an act of contribution. When you maintain your well-being, you increase your capacity to participate meaningfully in the lives of others. You become more present in your relationships, more effective in your work, and more capable of offering support when it is needed. In this sense, health enables not just personal happiness, but shared well-being. This challenges a common misconception that focusing on one's own health is somehow self-centered. In reality, the opposite is often true. Neglecting your health can limit your ability to engage with others, while maintaining it enhances your ability to contribute. The stronger and more balanced you are, the more you can give, whether that is time, attention, or guidance. At a broader level, this perspective also speaks to the kind of society we collectively create. A community composed of individuals who prioritize health is likely to be more productive, more cooperative, and more stable. There is less strain on systems, fewer preventable challenges, and a greater overall sense of well-being. While no society is free from difficulty, the general direction is shaped by the everyday choices of its members. What makes this idea particularly compelling is that it does not require large-scale change to begin. It starts with individuals, each person making decisions that align with health and balance. Over time, these decisions accumulate, intersect, and reinforce one another, gradually shifting the broader culture. So when we speak about choosing health, we are not just making a personal commitment. We are participating in a larger process, one that influences not only our own lives, but the lives of those around us. We are contributing to a standard that others may follow, whether consciously or unconsciously. And perhaps that is the most powerful realization of all. The way you choose to live does not end with you. It becomes part of the world others must live in. Because in the end, choosing health is not just about creating a better life for yourself, but about helping to create a better life for everyone connected to you.